I still remember the exact moment I stopped breathing. Not because something beautiful happened. Not because someone swept me off my feet or said something that made my heart crack open in the best way. No. I stopped breathing because the one person the universe had quietly, secretly, devastatingly chosen for me looked me dead in the eyes in front of everyone and chose someone else. Let me take you back there, because you need to feel it the way I felt it. You need to stand in that room with me, in that suffocating silence, with the pack watching and the candles flickering and the air thick with pine and cedar wood, and something ancient that only wolves can smell, that sacred electric pull that tells you, this is the one, and you need to understand what it feels like to have that feeling ripped from your chest before you even get to name it. His name was Caden Voss, alpha of the Black Ridge Pack, tall in the way that made rooms feel smaller, dark eyes that caught light like deep water, a jaw carved from something harder than stone, softer than pride. He wasn't just handsome. Handsome is too small a word for what Caden was. He was the kind of man that made your body register something before your brain caught up. Like thunder before the storm. Like the moment before a door swings open and changes your whole life. And I felt it the second I walked into that hall. That pull. God, that pull. It started in my chest, this low, warm hum, like a string being plucked deep inside my ribcage. Then it moved, down my spine, into my fingertips, into the soles of my feet. My wolf, she didn't growl, she didn't pace, she just stilled. Completely. The way prey stills when it finally stops running. The way a held breath feels right before you let go. She knew. I knew. Mate. The word didn't come with fireworks. It came with weight. With this quiet, certain, bone-deep knowing that sits underneath every other thought you've ever had. Like it was always there, waiting for you to find it. I had heard the older women in the pack describe it that way, like recognizing a song you've never heard before but somehow already know every word to. And standing there in the entrance of that great hall, wearing a dress that didn't quite fit and hair that I'd spent 2 hours on, I finally understood what they meant. He was across the room. And still I felt him like he was standing right next to me. I felt the heat of him. The gravity. Like my body had been quietly, without my permission, tilting toward him my entire life. Every step I'd ever taken had been angled, just slightly, in his direction. And I hadn't even known his name 3 hours ago. He turned. Our eyes met. And for one single, suspended, heartbreaking second, I saw it in him too. That flicker, that recognition, that half second where his whole face shifted and his body went rigid and his lips parted just slightly, like the breath had been punched clean out of him. His wolf knew. I could see it. The way his eyes darkened, the way his nostrils flared just barely, the way his hand, this big, steady alpha hand, curled slowly into a fist at his side, like he was trying to hold something in. He felt it. He felt me. And then, he looked away. Just like that. Like changing a channel. Like closing a book mid-sentence and setting it down and deciding it wasn't worth finishing. His jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, something complicated and cold and decided. And he turned back to the woman beside him, beautiful, polished, silver-blooded Serena Ashvale, with her perfect posture and her family name that meant something in every pack from here to the Northern Ridge. He reached out, and he took her hand, in front of everyone, in front of me. The hall went quiet in the way that only happens when something significant shifts. When the air itself understands that something has just been decided that cannot be undone. I heard whispers start at the edges of the room, felt eyes find my face, felt the heat of pity and curiosity, and that particular cruelty that lives in crowds, the one that makes people lean in when someone else is bleeding. I didn't move. I couldn't. Because here is the part that no one tells you about mate bond rejection. It isn't just emotional. It isn't just your feelings getting hurt, your pride taking a hit, your heart doing that familiar ache of disappointment. No, it is physical. It is a tearing. Somewhere just below your sternum, something that had just begun to knit itself together gets ripped back apart. And the pain of it, God, the pain of it is so clean, so precise, so personal that it takes everything you have not to make a sound. I pressed my nails into my palm, focused on that smaller, sharper pain, kept my face still, because I was not going to give them the satisfaction. Not the crowd. Not Serena, with her tilted chin and her careful eyes. And especially not him. Not Caden Voss, who had just looked at me, really looked at me and decided, in the space of a single breath, that I wasn't worth the complication. That I wasn't enough. But here's what I need you to understand, the thing that made it so much worse, so much more devastating than simple rejection. Even then, even in that moment, even with the pain splitting through me and the humiliation crawling up the back of my neck and the whole room watching me try not to fall apart, I still felt the pull. It didn't stop. It didn't care that he'd looked away. It didn't care that he'd chosen her. My body still ached toward him like a compass that only knows one direction. And I hated it. I hated myself for it. For the way I noticed, even through the hurt, how close he was standing to me now as he crossed the room, close enough that the warmth of him reached me, close enough that I caught the scent of him, dark cedar and night rain, and something underneath that was just him, just Caden, just mine in every way that should have mattered, and didn't. He walked past me without a word, without even a glance, and I stood there, in the middle of that great hall, holding myself together with nothing but stubbornness and the desperate, quiet prayer that no one could see how badly I was shaking. And I made myself a promise. Whatever this was, whatever the moon had decided, whatever fate had written in that invisible thread connecting my soul to his, I was not going to beg for it. I was not going to chase a man who looked at me and chose to look away. I was not going to let the bond make me small. I had survived things that would have broken most people. I could survive this too. Or at least that's what I told myself. Standing there in the ruins of a beginning that never got to start. But surviving and healing are two very different things. And the night wasn't finished with me yet. I had barely found the edges of my composure, barely stitched myself back together enough to breathe normally, to hold my chin at an angle that didn't betray me when I heard the room shift again. That particular silence that a crowd makes when something important is about to happen. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of held breath, of collective attention swinging, like a weather vane, toward a single point in the room. I felt him before I heard the footsteps. Of course I did. The bond didn't care that I was trying to protect myself. It didn't care that I had just made a promise to walk away with my dignity intact. The moment he started moving toward me, my whole nervous system lit up like someone had pressed a hand flat against a live wire. That warmth again, that terrible, traitorous warmth, rolling toward me in waves, getting stronger with every step he took in my direction, until I could feel him at my back the way you feel the sun. Not just warmth, but pressure, presence, weight. I turned slowly, because I refused to spin around, refused to look desperate, refused to let my body do what it wanted to do, which was close the distance between us and press my face into his chest and breathe him in until the pain stopped. He was closer than I expected. That was the first thing that broke something in me just a little. Just a hairline fracture. Because he hadn't stopped at a safe distance. He had walked to within arm's reach, and now he stood there, Caden Voss, Alpha of Blackridge, with the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face, and the entire pack fanning out behind him like a held breath given human form. And he looked at me, really looked at me this time. Not the way he had across the room, that quick flicker of recognition he'd shuddered so fast I might have imagined it. This was different. This was long, deliberate. His dark eyes moved over my face like he was memorizing something. Like he was looking for an answer to a question he hadn't said out loud yet. And I felt it. That look felt it the way you feel. A hand almost touching you. Close enough to matter. Not close enough to count. The bond flared. God. It flared this sudden, sharp, brilliant ache that bloomed straight through the center of my chest and radiated outward into my fingertips, my throat, the backs of my knees. My wolf surged forward inside me, pressing against my skin like she wanted out, like she recognized him on a cellular level and couldn't understand why we were still standing still. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to reach for him. I locked my knees, pressed my nails harder into my palm, and waited. He opened his mouth, closed it. Something moved through his expression there and gone so fast I couldn't name it. His jaw tightened. A muscle flexed just beneath his cheekbone, the way it does when someone is holding a word in their mouth that they're not sure they want to release. His scent reached me then, that dark cedar and night rain that I already knew was only his, and underneath it, something else. Something sharp and almost metallic. Something that smelled like conflict, like a man at war with himself in real time. Even my wolf noticed it. She paused in her pressing, tilted her head. "He's not as certain as he looks," she seemed to say, but certain enough. That much became clear in the next breath, because Caden Voss straightened to his full height, and there is something deeply unfair about how tall this man is, how much space he takes up just by existing, how the room seemed to physically reorganize itself around him. And he spoke. Not loudly. He didn't need to. Alphas never do. "I won't mark her." 4 words. 4 words, and I felt the entire room exhale. 4 words, and I felt them land in my chest like stones dropped into still water, each one sending out rings that moved through me in slow, devastating waves. I heard the whispers start immediately, that particular vicious rustle of a crowd processing something scandalous, something that would be retold at every fire and every table for months. I heard someone to my left make a soft, sympathetic sound that was somehow worse than silence. I heard Serena Ashvale say nothing, which meant she had known this was coming, which meant this had been decided somewhere I wasn't, in a room I wasn't invited to, about a future I hadn't been consulted on. I couldn't breathe. Not because I was falling apart. I want to be clear about that. I was not going to fall apart in front of these people. Not today, not ever, not for this. But there is a particular physical response to rejection that has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the way the bond works, the way it reaches into your biology and rearranges things at a level beneath thought, beneath choice, so that when the other half of it pulls away, your body actually registers it as damage, as loss. My lungs simply forgot, for a moment, how to do their job. My vision sharpened at the edges in that strange way that happens when shock meets adrenaline. My heart, my stubborn, stupid, already bruised heart beat twice, hard, like it was trying to remind itself it was still there. It was still there. I was still there. I breathed in through my nose, out through my mouth, once. Slowly. I felt the air fill me, cool and steady, and I used it to build something, a wall, thin but real, between what I was feeling and what I was going to let anyone see. And then I lifted my eyes to his. He was still watching me, still had that look on his face, that complicated, weighted, almost anguished expression that he clearly thought he was keeping hidden but wasn't. Not from me. Not with the bond still lived between us, still humming at that low, terrible frequency that connected us whether either of us wanted it to or not. I could feel his conflict the way you feel a change in weather in your joints, in your skin, before the storm is even visible. His jaw tightened again. He blinked. Once. And for just a fraction of a second, half a breath, barely a moment, his hand moved. Almost imperceptibly. The fingers of his right hand shifted, just slightly, toward me, like something in him had reached before the rest of him could stop it. Then he pulled it back, curled it into a fist at his side, and looked away. That was the moment I made my choice. Not from rage, though. Rage was there, quiet and clean and completely justified. Not from humiliation, though I was drowning in it. Had been drowning in it since the moment he took Serena's hand. Would probably be drowning in it for longer than I wanted to admit. No. The choice came from something older and quieter than all of that. It came from the part of me that had learned, a long time ago, in harder circumstances than this, that no one who makes you beg for their love is worth the kneeling. I would not beg. Not for his mark. Not for his name. Not for the acknowledgement that I deserved and he was choosing, deliberately, to withhold. I took one step forward. Just one. Close enough that I could see the exact moment his breath changed. I saw his chest expand, that deep, involuntary inhale that the bond pulls out of you when the other person gets near. Saw the subtle shift in his posture, that almost imperceptible leaning, like even his body was confused about the decision his mind had made. His scent spiked again, that sharp, conflicted undercurrent spiking harder now, mixing with something else beneath it, something that smelled uncomfortably close to longing. Good. I wanted him to feel it. I wanted him to stand there in his certainty, and his alpha authority, and his carefully arranged future, and feel every single thing he was throwing away. I held his gaze. And I said it quietly, without trembling, without tears, with every ounce of dignity I had left, and a few ounces I borrowed from somewhere I'd find later. Then let me go. The words fell into that packed, airless room like a match into still water small, but the ripple of them was enormous. I heard the silence change quality, felt the crowd's breath catch collectively, because this was not the response they had expected from the unnamed, unclaimed girl with the ordinary bloodline and the dress that didn't quite fit. They had expected tears, pleading, the particular kind of devastated performance that makes everyone in the room feel better about watching something cruel happen. I gave them nothing. I gave him nothing. Except those 4 words, clean and final and absolutely, completely meant. His eyes came back to mine, and something in them, something that had nothing to do with his decision and everything to do with the truth underneath it, fractured. Just slightly, just enough that I saw it before he buried it. Pain. Actual pain. Moving through those dark eyes like a shadow crossing water. His nostrils flared. His jaw worked. His fist still curled at his side tightened until I could see the tension tracking up his forearm. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I didn't wait for a better one. I turned, squaring my shoulders with the last of what I had in me, walked toward the doors of that great hall with every step measured, every breath controlled, the bond pulling at me with each stride like a hook set deep in my sternum, aching, insisting, begging me to turn around. I didn't turn around. The doors opened. The cold night air hit my face like a hand, sharp and real and blessedly indifferent to everything that had just happened inside. And I stepped through out of the firelight, out of the watching eyes, out of the life that fate had apparently drafted for me without bothering to ask if I wanted it. Behind me, I heard the doors swing shut. And then, just barely, just at the edge of hearing, just enough that I could have told myself I imagined it, I heard him say my name. Once, low and rough and quiet, like a sound pulled out of him against his will. I kept walking. I made it to the tree line before my legs gave out. Not all the way I didn't fall. I caught myself on the bark of an old pine, both hands flat against the rough surface, head dropped forward, breath coming in these slow, deliberate pulls that were the only thing standing between me and complete dissolution. The cold was sharp out here, away from the hall, away from the bodies and the candles and the suffocating warmth of a room full of people watching me bleed. Out here it was just the dark and the trees and the distant sound of the river and the sky pressing down, vast and indifferent and salted with stars that didn't care at all what had just happened to me. I let myself have 60 seconds. 60 seconds to shake, to press my forehead against the bark and feel its roughness ground me, to let my wolf pace and whine and do that low, mournful thing she did when she was hurting and didn't know what to do with it. 60 seconds to be completely, privately devastated. Then I straightened, wiped my face with the back of my hand, and walked back to the small quarters I'd been assigned at the edge of the Blackridge territory, a guest room in the outer lodge, simple and spare, smelling of cedar shavings and old wool. I didn't light the lamp. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark, still in the dress that didn't fit, and I told myself that the worst of it was over. I was wrong. The worst of it started at midnight. I was lying down by then, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, doing that particular kind of not sleeping where your body is exhausted but your mind is running at a frequency too high for rest. The bond had settled into a dull, background ache present, persistent, the emotional equivalent of a bruise you keep accidentally pressing. Manageable. I was managing it. And then it wasn't dull anymore. It started as warmth. Just warmth spreading through my chest, moving up my throat, into my jaw, pooling in my lower stomach with a heaviness that had no business being there. I sat up, pressed a hand to my sternum. My wolf went completely still inside me, ears back, every hair raised. No, I thought, but the bond doesn't negotiate. I felt him laugh. That was the first thing his laugh, not heard but felt, moving through me like low music through a wall, the vibration of it reaching me even across the distance between his chambers and mine. And then warmth again, but different this time, more specific, localized, like a hand at the back of a neck, like fingers tracing a collarbone, like the particular devastating heat of someone's mouth against skin that should have been mine. I felt him touch her. And I want you to understand what that means, really understand it, because it is not metaphor. It is not paranoia. It is not the jealous imagination of a woman already raw from humiliation. The mate bond is a living thing. It is a thread of something ancient and biological woven between two people at the soul level, and it conducts sensation the way copper conducts electricity efficiently, indiscriminately, without asking your permission first. What he felt, I felt. What moved through his body moved through mine, translated and secondhand, and agonizing in a way that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with wrongness. It felt wrong. It felt like wearing someone else's skin, like hearing your own name in a voice that isn't yours, like watching something precious being handled carelessly by hands that don't know its value. I tasted her laughter in my mouth. I don't know how else to describe it. Joy that wasn't mine, warmth that wasn't mine, the specific, intimate ease of two people choosing each other freely and fully, all of it bleeding through the bond like ink through wet paper, saturating me until I couldn't tell anymore where her happiness ended and my misery began. I curled into myself, drew my knees to my chest, pressed my face into the pillow, breathed through it one breath, then another, the way you breathe through physical pain when there is nothing else to do. My wolf had stopped pacing. She was just lying down inside me now, head on her paws, making that low continuous sound that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a howl, and was somehow more heartbreaking than either. I felt him kiss her. And that was the one that broke through every wall I had built since walking out of that hall. Because it wasn't violent, wasn't sharp, it was tender. I felt the tenderness of it, secondhand and scalding, this slow, deliberate warmth that moved through the bond like something he meant, like something he had chosen, and the cruelty of it wasn't that he was doing it. The cruelty was that I could feel it was real. Whatever he felt in that moment, it was real. And it wasn't for me. It was never going to be for me. I pressed the heel of my hand against my sternum and pushed, like I could physically hold the bond closed, like pressure could stop the bleeding. It couldn't. Somewhere across the lodge, across the territory, across the distance that should have protected me and didn't, Caden Voss was spending his night wrapped in someone else. And I spent mine lying in the dark in a dress that didn't fit, feeling every moment of it, sensation arriving stripped of context and full of meaning, until sometime deep in the dark hours, my body simply gave out from the exhaustion of feeling too much and pulled me under into something that was not quite sleep. I dreamed of his hands, not touching her, not touching anyone, just his hands, still. The way they had looked curled at his side when he said those 4 words, the way the tension had run up his forearm, the way one of them had moved toward me, just slightly, before he pulled it back. My sleeping mind kept returning to that motion, that half-inch reach that he'd arrested before it became anything. My wolf, even in dreams, kept tilting toward it, reading it, turning it over. He moved toward me, she kept saying. Before he stopped himself, he moved toward me. I woke before dawn with my jaw clenched and my eyes dry and something new sitting quietly in my chest where the worst of the pain had been. Clarity. Not peace. I wasn't naive enough to call it peace. But clarity has its own particular quality, its own specific weight, and I recognized it immediately because I had felt it before. I had felt it at 16, standing in the wreckage of everything my old life had been, deciding what the new one was going to look like. I had felt it at 18, the first time I ran the border alone in wolf form, and understood for the first time what it meant to belong to yourself completely. I knew what clarity felt like. It felt like a decision already made. I sat up in the gray pre-dawn light, and I said it out loud quietly, just to myself, just to the empty room and the pale square of window and the cedar smell of a place I was already leaving in every way that mattered. I wasn't leaving for revenge. I needed to be honest with myself about that. Revenge is loud. Revenge wants an audience, wants him to see and to know and to regret. What I felt was quieter than that. Cleaner. I was leaving because somewhere between midnight and dawn, lying in the dark feeling another woman's happiness moving through my body, I had understood something fundamental and irreversible. Staying here would kill me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly in the way that proximity to the bond without any of its mercy kills you. like water damage, like erosion, like the kind of destruction that is total before it is visible. I wanted to live. That was all. That was everything. So I got up, washed my face, changed my clothes with the deliberate calm of someone who has stopped fighting the current and started swimming perpendicular to it. And then I sat at the small desk by the window, and I opened the worn leather journal I kept in the bottom of my travel bag, and I wrote down a name. Kael Dravan, Alpha King of the Ashen Court. I had been collecting information about him the way you collect information about a thunderstorm carefully, from a distance, with the full understanding that knowing its trajectory doesn't make it safe. What I knew was this. He ruled the largest sovereign pact territory on the continent. He had taken that territory not by inheritance but by force, by defeating 3 separate alphas in succession challenges before his 25th year. Every pack this side of the northern ridge operated in some relationship to him, whether they admitted it or not, Blackridge included. The whispers about him were not gentle. Ruthless, people said, and not the way they say it about men they secretly admire for their efficiency. They said it the way you describe weather. A fact, a feature of the landscape. He does not warn you twice. That one I'd heard from 3 separate sources, in 3 different territories, and the consistency of it told me it wasn't rumor. He takes what he decides is his and he doesn't apologize for the taking. That one sat in my stomach uncomfortably, for reasons I wasn't ready to examine in the gray light of a morning where I was still raw from the night before. Possessive, they said. Controlled. Precise. Dangerous in the particular way that patient things are dangerous not because they are always moving, but because they are always watching. And by the time you realize they have been watching you specifically, the decision has already been made. This was the man I was considering crossing into. This was the territory I was considering petitioning for asylum. I told myself it was strategy, pure geometry, the enemy of your enemy, the strength of a larger protection, the simple mathematics of survival, and it was all of those things. I am not going to pretend I walked into this blind. I knew the risk. I cataloged it carefully, sitting at that desk in the gray dawn, turning it over with the same methodical calm I used for everything that scared me. But here is the thing about honesty, the real kind. The kind you can only manage when you're alone and exhausted and have nothing left to protect. His name in my handwriting made something move in my chest. Something that had nothing to do with strategy, because I had seen Kael Dravan once. Only once. 14 months ago, at a border summit that I had attended as a low-ranking member of a diplomatic contingent background, essentially. Furniture with a pulse. I had stood at the edge of the gathering in my unremarkable position and watched the alphas move through their careful performances of alliance and authority, and I had noticed him the way you notice a storm system on the horizon, not because you went looking for it, but because something in your animal brain flagged it before your conscious mind caught up. He had been standing apart from the others, still in that specific way, that powerful men sometimes are not passive stillness, but the stillness of something coiled, watchful. His face had been unreadable in the way that faces are when their owner has spent years making sure of it. Dark, severe, beautiful in the architectural sense, the kind of face built for consequence. And he had been looking at me, not glancing. Not the sweep of a room read that catches everything and registers nothing. Looking. Directly. Specifically. At me at unremarkable background, furniture, with a pulse me with those pale, extraordinary eyes that I later learned people described as silver, but were something more complicated than that. Something that shifted, like light on moving water. I had looked away first. Immediately. Reflexively. The way you look away from something too bright. And when I had gathered the nerve to look back 3 seconds later, maybe 4, he had still been watching. He hadn't looked away when I did. He hadn't looked away at all. I had spent 14 months telling myself it meant nothing. That it was a territorial assessment, an alpha cataloging the unfamiliar, the instinctive surveillance of a predator in a room full of strangers. I had told myself this in the convincing way. You tell yourself things that you don't entirely believe but need to function. Now, sitting at that desk with his name in my handwriting and the bond ache still sitting bruised in my chest and a decision crystallizing in the cold morning air around me, I let myself remember the way it had felt. To be seen like that, by eyes like that, fully, deliberately, like I was not background at all, like I was exactly what he had been looking for. I closed the journal, stood up, and began to pack. I packed light. You learn that early. When you grow up the way I did, you learn to identify the things that are truly yours versus the things you've simply been allowed to hold for a while. I took what was mine, left everything else exactly as I'd found it. And when the first gray light of actual morning began to separate the sky from the tree line, I slipped out of the outer lodge like smoke, like something that had never quite been there to begin with, and I moved toward the river. The Ashfin River. The border. The line that every wolf on this side of the continent was taught, from the time they were old enough to understand territory, that you did not cross without an invitation, without escort, without the explicit sanction of the Ashen Court. Crossing uninvited was not technically suicide technically, but the distinction between technically and practically had gotten more than a few wolves killed, and everyone knew it. I knew it. I crossed anyway. The water was brutal. I had known it would be cold, but cold is an insufficient word for what the Ashfen does to you in the early morning in late autumn. It is a full-body assault. Ice melt from the northern peaks still running in its veins, hitting your skin like something with intention. Like the river itself is trying to make a point about whether you belong here. I waded into my waist and kept moving, because stopping meant feeling it, and feeling it meant possibly reconsidering. And I had not come this far to reconsider in the middle of a river. My wolf was fading. That was the part I hadn't let myself fully register until the cold water made it impossible to ignore. The night's bond torture had taken something from her, from both of us, that hadn't come back with the dawn. She was quiet inside me in a way that wasn't peace, wasn't rest. It was depletion. The specific, frightening silence of a wolf whose energy reserves have been eaten through by sustained emotional damage, leaving something thin and flickering where her fire used to be. My legs were heavier than they should have been. My breath was coming shorter. Every step through the current required a negotiation with a body that was running on nothing but stubbornness, and the memory of a decision made at a desk in the dark. I made the other bank, pulled myself up onto the frost-stiff grass, dripping, shaking, approximately 3 degrees warmer than the river I'd just crossed, and stood. I got approximately 40 seconds before they came out of the trees. 4 of them. Ashen Court warriors, in the way that told you immediately not the armor, not the weapons, but the way they moved, coordinated without signal, efficient without urgency. The particular lethal calm of people who are very good at their work and have stopped needing to perform that fact. They fanned out in a containment pattern so smooth it was almost beautiful, positioning themselves around me with the practiced ease of a closing hand. The one in front was built like architecture. Dark-skinned, shaved head, a scar running from his left temple to his jaw that he wore with the comfort of someone who'd long since made peace with its story. His eyes were flat and assessing, moving over me with the speed of a threat calculation that I was clearly failing. He said nothing. Neither did any of the others. They just watched me. I was soaking wet, shaking from cold in a way I couldn't control regardless of how much I wanted to. My wolf was a guttering candle inside me where she usually burned steady. I was standing on the wrong side of the most dangerous border on the continent, having committed the kind of territorial violation that ended badly for people in much better condition than I was currently in. I straightened my spine, lifted my chin, and looked the lead warrior directly in his flat, assessing eyes. Take me to your alpha. Not a request. I was deliberate about that. Deliberate about the absence of pleas, of apology, of any of the softening language that would have told them exactly how desperate I was, and handed them the leverage of it. 4 words, clean and direct, in the same register I had used in that hall the night before. The register that had cost me everything to find and that I was apparently now committed to as a personal standard. The warrior's eyes narrowed, just slightly. You crossed our border, he said. His voice was low, precise. The voice of a man who doesn't raise it. I'm aware. Uninvited. Also aware. A beat. Something moved through his expression. Not softness, not sympathy, but something adjacent to recalibration, like he had been prepared for crying, for begging, for the particular desperate performance of someone who knows they've made a catastrophic error and is trying to spend charm they don't have to cover the cost of it. My flatness had disrupted his expectation. I watched him adjust. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something in the low, rapid dialect of the Ashen Court to the warrior on his left. The other man's eyebrows moved approximately 2 millimeters, which, based on his face, I suspected was the equivalent of open shock. "Move," the lead warrior said to me. I moved. They took me through dense forest old growth, the kind that has its own atmosphere, its own particular quality of dark and quiet, where the canopy is so thick overhead that the morning light arrived filtered and diffuse, green-gray and cathedral still. The territory smelled different here, not just unfamiliar different, in a fundamental way, denser with something I couldn't name, like the land itself was saturated with the signature of a very old, very powerful wolf. His signature. Even through the cold and the exhaustion, I could feel it faint but unmistakable, woven into the very air of this place. My wolf lifted her head for the first time since dawn, ears forward, something moving through her depleted stillness that wasn't quite alertness yet but was pointed in that direction. "I know that," she said quietly. "I know that smell." I didn't answer her. We reached the outer stronghold as the morning fully broke a structure that was not what I had expected, which meant it was exactly right for him, for what I knew of him. Not the ostentatious architecture of alphas who need their power reflected back at them in stone and height. It was low, sprawling, built into the landscape rather than imposed upon it. Dark timber and gray stone, functional and severe, every line of it suggesting that the things that happened inside it were serious and the people who built it knew that. Banners bearing the Ashen Court insignia, a wolf skull over a burning crown, hung still in the cold morning air. The lead warrior brought me through a series of corridors. He stopped at a set of heavy doors, knocked twice. A pause. Then a voice from inside said, simply, "In." One word. And even muffled through heavy wood, even reduced to a single syllable, I felt it move through me like a frequency. Deep and controlled and calibrated, the voice of someone who had spent years understanding exactly how much force words carry and choosing, always, to use only as much as necessary. The doors opened. He was standing at the far end of the room with his back to me. I had a few seconds to take in the space stone floors, high windows letting in cold white morning light, a map table covered in documents, a fire burning low in a deep hearth to the left. Functional. No excess. A room that said this is where work happens and nothing softer. And then he turned, and 14 months disappeared like they'd never happened. He was exactly as I remembered, and completely different from how memory had managed to keep him. Memory had preserved the structure, the severe, architectural face, the pale eyes, the particular quality of stillness he occupied, but it had failed to accurately render the weight of him. The way presence accumulated around him in the room like pressure accumulates before a storm. The way looking at him directly required a specific, conscious decision, like looking at something very bright. He was looking at me, the same way he had at the border summit, fully, specifically, without the social performance of pretending to assess the room when you are actually assessing a person. I felt heat move through me, and I want to be honest about what kind of heat that was, because I owe you honesty even when it's inconvenient. It was not entirely from the fire. It was not entirely from the warmth of the room against my cold-soaked skin. It was the specific, involuntary warmth of being looked at by someone whose eyes do something to your nervous system that you didn't authorize and cannot entirely explain. He let the silence hold for a long moment. Then he moved. He walked toward me slowly, not the circling of a threat display, not the approach of someone testing dominance, but something more deliberate than either. He moved around me, at a distance, and I understood that he was reading me the way his kind read everything, not just visually, but in layers, scent, posture, the information that bodies carry underneath the stories their owners are trying to tell. I held very still, kept my breathing measured, tried not to let him see the shaking that the cold had started and that something else, something I wasn't naming, was continuing. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I had to adjust my chin upward to hold his gaze, which I did, because I was not going to look at his chest in this moment regardless of how much easier that would have been. His pale eyes moved over my face, down, noted my soaked clothing, the pallor of cold and exhaustion beneath my skin, the way my hands, my traitorous, cold-shocked hands were trembling slightly at my sides, despite everything I was doing to stop them. His eyes came back to mine. "You crossed into my territory to die?" His voice in the open room was exactly what it had been through the door. Low, controlled, carrying the particular resonance of something that doesn't need volume to reach you. There was no mockery in it, no cruelty, just a flat, genuine question from a man trying to accurately understand what was in front of him. I let one breath out through my nose. "No," I said, "to live." Something shifted in his face. Subtle, this man did not deal in obvious expressions. I was already understanding that, but something moved, deep behind those pale eyes. Some internal adjustment that I couldn't fully read yet, but that felt significant. He studied me for another long moment. Then he took one step closer. My breath did something embarrassing. I managed to keep it off my face mostly, but my wolf surged forward inside me, sudden and interested in a way she hadn't been since before the river, pressing toward him with a recognition I didn't have context for yet, and that I was not going to examine right now. He was close enough now that I could feel the warmth coming off him, which was deeply inconvenient given that I was soaked through and shaking, and my body had apparently decided that this was the moment to become very, very aware of warmth as a concept. He looked at my hands, at the shaking. Something moved across his jaw fast, almost invisible, like the flicker of an instinct he'd caught before it fully registered on his face. He lowered his voice. Not a whisper, he didn't whisper, but quieter, more private, like he was removing the words from the room and handing them specifically to me. "You look like you'd faint if I growled." I blinked. Of all the things I had prepared for interrogation, hostility, the calculated assessment of an alpha deciding whether an uninvited wolf on his land was a threat or an asset, I had not prepared for the particular dry quality in those words. The fraction of something that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. I looked at him for exactly 1 second. "Then don't growl," I said. His mouth moved, just barely, just enough, and the room felt, for one extraordinary moment, like something other than what it was. He did not ask me to sit, but he did not send me away. He stood before me with those pale eyes and that unreadable face and that patience of his. The particular patience that I was beginning to understand was not passive but the opposite of passive, was in fact an active choice he made continuously, and he asked me, simply and without preamble, why I had come. I told him, not everything, not the bond, not the midnight hours, not the specific agony of lying in the dark feeling another woman's happiness move through my body, but the shape of it. Enough. I told him I was leaving Blackridge, that I needed asylum, that I was prepared to negotiate terms. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, the silence stretched for long enough that I had to work to stay still inside it. Then he said, "Extend your neck." My heart stopped, restarted. I understood immediately what he was asking. A mark of asylum, not a mate mark, not a claim, but a territorial acknowledgement. A biological signature pressed into the skin that told every wolf on the continent that this person stood under the protection of a specific alpha. It was formal, transactional, practiced. It required proximity and trust in measures that made my skin prickle with something that was not entirely wariness. I reached up, moved my hair to one side with fingers that were not entirely steady, tilted my head. My pulse was everywhere, in my throat, in my temples, in my wrists, in places I hadn't known had pulses until this moment. I kept my eyes open and forward because I wanted him to see, needed him to see that I was not afraid. Or rather, that whatever I was, it was not the kind of afraid that flinches, the kind that turns and runs. I had crossed a river this morning on a guttering wolf and 3 days of accumulated damage. I was not going to undo that impression now by closing my eyes. He stepped toward me, and then stopped. His hand came up first. Not his mouth, his hand. Large and warm, and I felt the warmth of it before contact. A half-second of proximity that my skin registered with embarrassing accuracy. And then his fingers touched my throat. Lightly, just his fingertips, placed with a carefulness that had no business existing on hands that had apparently defeated 3 alphas in succession challenges. tracing the line of my pulse slowly, like he was reading it, like the information in it mattered to him, like he was asking my body a question that he didn't trust words to answer accurately. My breath went completely still. Every cell I owned became aware of those fingertips. He was close enough now that I could see the detail of his face, the faint line of an old scar along his cheekbone, the way his jaw was set, the way those pale eyes had darkened slightly at the edges. He was watching my throat, watching his own fingers against my pulse, and something in his expression had shifted into territory that I absolutely could not read, but that made the air between us feel considerably thinner than it had been 30 seconds ago. He didn't bite. He stood there with his fingers at my throat and the fire burning low behind him, and the cold morning pressing at the windows, and he simply held still, holding the moment, withholding the thing that the moment was building toward. And there was something in that restraint, in the deliberate, chosen quality of it, that undid me far more efficiently than the touch itself. His eyes came up to mine, held. "If I mark you," he said quietly, precisely, in that voice that delivered everything at minimum volume and maximum impact, "I don't give you back." The words landed in the center of my chest and stayed there. I felt their weight, felt the layers in them, the warning, yes, the territorial fact of it, the alpha stating terms with characteristic economy. But underneath that, beneath the transactional surface, something else was moving. Something that his controlled face and his measured voice and his carefully maintained stillness couldn't entirely contain. Something that his fingers still warm against my throat, still reading my pulse with that terrifying gentleness, were saying more clearly than his words. I held his gaze, didn't blink, didn't step back. "I heard you," I said, and I did not move my neck. He marked me, just barely, just enough. A light press of his teeth against the curve of my neck that lasted less than a second and left a mark so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't looking. But every wolf within scent range would feel it like a shout. Ashen Court. Protected. His. He stepped back immediately after. Put distance between us with the same deliberate care he seemed to apply to everything. Straightened. And looked at me with that face that gave nothing away and somehow communicated everything, and said that his head of house would show me to quarters, and that I would begin integration assessments in the morning. Transactional. Clean. Final. I nodded, and tried to pretend that the place on my throat where his fingers had been wasn't still warm. The first morning, I slept until noon and woke feeling like something that had been wrung out and left to dry at an inconvenient angle. My wolf was still quiet, less dangerously so. The thin flickering of the night before replaced by something steadier, but far from the full, easy burn of a wolf in her own territory, comfortable and safe. This wasn't home. My body knew it. She knew it. We were both operating in that particular heightened state of alertness that comes from being somewhere unfamiliar, where every sound requires a split-second assessment, and your nervous system never quite drops below a low hum of readiness. But no one looked at me with pity here. That was the thing I noticed first, and kept noticing in those early days. In Blackridge, pity had followed me like weather in the eyes of people who knew what had happened, in the careful way conversations rerouted when I walked in the particular social cruelty of people who mean well and cause harm anyway. Here, no one knew my story. No one looked at me and saw the girl who hadn't been enough. They looked at me and saw an unknown which was uncomfortable in its own way, carrying its own specific weight of wariness and assessment, but unknown is not the same as lesser. Unknown I could work with. The integration assessments were straightforward. Combat evaluation, territorial knowledge, pack hierarchy comprehension. I moved through them with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned that competence is the most reliable form of self-protection, and I did not perform weakness even when I felt it, and I did not perform strength I didn't have. The training ground was where it happened. Third day, early morning. They had me running drills with the outer guard, not a test of belonging, more a calibration of what I could contribute, where I fit in the architecture of the court's defense structure. I was holding. For the first hour I was holding well, actually moving cleanly through the sequences, my wolf responding better than she had since the river, something about the physical work loosening the residual tension in my body that rest alone hadn't reached. And then the ground tilted. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing about that kind of exhaustion, it doesn't announce itself. One moment I was mid-sequence, weight shifting forward, arm coming up for a block, and then my legs simply reported that they were done. My vision grayed at the edges. My knees buckled. I didn't hit the ground. I hit him. He was there, and I did not know he had come to the training ground, had not heard him approach, had not felt him until he was already catching me, one arm coming around my waist and the other at my shoulder, solid and immediate and warm in a way that went straight through every layer of training composure I'd constructed over the past 3 days, and touched something underneath that wasn't composure at all. I grabbed his forearm on instinct, felt the muscle of it, the solidity, the realness, and then became extremely aware, all at once, of how close we were. His chest against my shoulder, his arm around my waist, his face inclined toward me with an expression I was too close to fully read, but that felt not distant, not the measured, transactional face of the man in the study. Something with more edges to it, something with more movement. "I'm fine," I said. "You're not," he said, not harshly, just factually, in the way he stated things that were true and didn't see the use in softening. His hand at my waist didn't move. It stayed for 3 full seconds longer than strictly necessary for ensuring I wasn't going to fall. I counted them. Against my better judgment, against every sensible instinct I had, I counted them because they mattered in a way I wasn't prepared to analyze and couldn't seem to stop noticing. 3 seconds. His hand, warm and large and still, at the curve of my waist. Then he stepped back, set me on my feet with a precision that managed to be both careful and completely formal. "Rest," he said. To me, but also somehow to the training ground in general, a quiet redistribution of attention, pulling the eyes of the guards back to their own work and off of me, accomplished without a single word directed at anyone other than myself. I rested, and tried not to think about the warmth that lingered at my waist long after his hand had left it. The advisor meeting was 3 hours later, and I was not supposed to be there. I understood that. I had been shown to a seat at the outer edge of the war room, not at the table, not among the principals, but against the wall with the attendants and the record keepers. Present as part of the information-gathering process of my integration. Observed, not consulted. The objections started almost immediately. There were 4 of them, senior advisors of the Ashen Court, men and women who had been navigating pack politics since before I was born, whose authority in this room was real and earned, and whose concerns, I was willing to admit, were not entirely without logic. I was an unknown from a rival territory, newly marked, with no demonstrated loyalty and no established role. Every pack instinct they had was flagging me as a variable that hadn't been accounted for. The eldest, a woman named Sarah, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, and clearly accustomed to being the most dangerous mind in most rooms, spoke first. "Her presence here is a liability," she said without looking at me, directly to Kale, clean and unambiguous. "We don't know her motivations. We don't know her capabilities. We don't know who she's reported to or what information she was sent to gather. Asylum is one thing, integration at this level is another." The others signaled agreement. Not overtly, these were not people who did anything overtly, but in the particular, practiced language of people long accustomed to communicating without giving opponents purchase. I kept my face neutral, kept my breathing even, did not look at him. "Her motivations are documented," Kale said. His voice was exactly the same as it always was, controlled, even utterly unperformed. "Her capabilities are being assessed. Until that assessment is complete, the question of integration level is mine to determine." Sarah's eyes moved to me for the first time. "She came from Blackridge. She left Blackridge," he said. The distinction, delivered that flatly, closed something in the room. Sarah's eyes returned to him, held his gaze for a long moment. The specific kind of hold that passes between 2 people who respect each other enough to have the fight properly, and then, with the precision of someone who knows when a position is held and when it isn't, she moved on. I had been watching him through all of it. Not obviously. From the edge of my vision, with the careful peripheral attention of someone trained not to stare at things they need to understand. And I noticed at some point during Sarah's second line of objection, without any announcement or apparent decision, he had shifted. Just slightly. He was standing between me and the table. Not dramatically. Not in the performed, look at me protecting someone way. Just angled. His body positioned so that the line of fire from the advisor's attention passed through him before it reached me. A small thing. A thing I was possibly reading too much into. But I had been in enough rooms to know when a body is placed deliberately. And his was. I couldn't sleep that night. This was not new sleep, and I had been conducting difficult negotiations since the night of the rejection, with mixed results. But it was worse that night, for reasons that had less to do with the bond and more to do with the particular overstimulation of a mind that had taken in too much and couldn't find a clean place to set it down. I lay in the dark of my assigned quarters and watched the ceiling and listened to the stronghold settle around me. And at some point I gave up on sleep entirely and simply sat up and let the dark be what it was. The knock came so lightly I almost didn't hear it. I went still. "It's me." 2 words. In that voice, unnecessary identification I had known before the words. Something in me had known the quality of his presence through a closed door, which was either the mark of acute situational awareness or something else that I wasn't naming. I opened the door. He was holding 2 cups of something that steamed in the cold corridor air. He looked at me for a moment at my clearly awake for a while face, at the dark under my eyes, at whatever it was my expression was doing that I hadn't managed to fully assemble before opening the door. He extended 1 cup toward me. I took it. He came inside. Not expansively, not taking up the room the way he could have, not filling it with his presence in the way that powerful men sometimes do to remind you of the geography of authority. He moved to the chair by the window, the one furthest from the bed, and he sat, wrapped both hands around his own cup, looked out at the dark outside the glass, and simply stayed. He didn't speak first. Neither did I. We sat in the particular silence of 2 people who have stopped performing ease and arrived, almost accidentally, at the actual thing. The tea was something with dried bark and pine resin, and something faintly bitter underneath. Medicinal, functional, the kind of thing that makes no promises about being pleasant, but keeps the one about keeping you warm. I held the cup in both hands, and let the heat of it move through my fingers and up my arms, and didn't say anything for long enough that when I did speak, it came out quieter than I intended. He said I was weak. I hadn't planned to say it. It arrived the way true things sometimes do when your defenses are tired, not invited, just present, sitting in the air between us before I'd decided to put it there. Cale didn't react immediately. Didn't pivot toward me with the aggressive sympathy of someone who has been waiting for the wound to show so they can position themselves near it. He let the words exist for a moment, gave them room. Then he turned his head toward me, slowly, and looked at me across the distance of that room with those pale eyes that saw things clearly and made no apology for it. "You crossed enemy land alone," he said, "on a fading wolf, after a full night of bond damage." A pause, precise and weighted. Weak is not the word I would use. I felt those words land somewhere deep, not because they were comfort, though they were, but because they were specific. He wasn't offering the vague, wide reassurance of someone who wants you to feel better and doesn't much care how they achieve it. He was citing evidence, looking at what had actually happened and naming it accurately. And there is something about being seen accurately, after a long period of being seen incorrectly, that is almost physically overwhelming. I pressed my lips together, looked back at the window. "He made the decision before he saw me," I said. "That's the part I keep." I stopped, reorganized. He had already decided. Whatever I was, it didn't factor in. "Then his loss is geometric," Cale said quietly. "Not personal." I looked at him. He was already looking at me. The fire had burned down low while we talked, and the room was lit mostly by the outside dark and the faint ambient glow of the stronghold's perimeter lights through the window glass, and in that low light his face had lost some of its severity. Not all of it, I suspected, all of it never fully left, but enough. Enough that what I was looking at felt less like an alpha king in his own territory, and more like a man sitting across a room at an hour that belongs only to people who can't sleep, being honest because the dark makes honesty easier. He set his cup down on the windowsill, and then he stood, and crossed the room. He moved slowly enough that every step was visible. Every decision announced nothing sudden, nothing that would require a flinch or a step back. He came to where I was sitting at the edge of the bed, and he stopped. And he looked down at me, and then with a carefulness so deliberate it made my breath catch, he raised his hand and cupped my face, both hands, his palms warm against my cheekbones, his thumbs resting light along the line of my jaw, holding my face the way you hold something you're afraid of damaging. Not possessive, not yet. Something more careful than possession. Something that felt like a question, asked with hands instead of words, waiting for an answer in the space between us. My breath stopped entirely. I looked up at him, at those pale, serious eyes, close now in a way they hadn't been since the study, since his fingers at my throat, and the firelight, and the weight of words that weren't quite a warning. Close enough that I could see the small shift in his expression, the thing moving behind the control, the thing that his face hadn't been built to hide at this distance, at this hour, in this particular unguarded light. He tilted my face up slightly, lowered his head, and the air between us became the most significant thing in the room, that last inch of space, charged and still, both of us breathing in it, both of us utterly aware of the other's awareness, the slow burn of it so acute, it was almost indistinguishable from pain. The door opened, not the gentle knock of someone uncertain, the firm, functional push of someone with a reason, his head of house, already speaking before she'd fully cleared the threshold, something about a border report, a flag on the eastern perimeter, a runner waiting. She stopped when she saw us. Cale's hands dropped from my face. He stepped back. 1 step. 2. The distance reassembled between us with a speed that left me cold in a way the room's temperature didn't entirely account for. He turned toward his head of house with the seamless composure of a man who had never been anything other than composed, and said quietly that he'd be there in a moment. She left. He looked back at me once. Just once. And in that one look, in those pale eyes, in that low light, unguarded for exactly as long as the door took to close behind her, I saw everything he hadn't said. Then he left, and I sat in the quiet of the room with my face still warm where his hands had been, and the space between us still charged with the thing that hadn't happened yet, but felt, with a certainty that sat bone deep and unignorable, like it was only a matter of time. I didn't find out about the assembly until an hour before it happened. His head of house came to my quarters with that particular expression of someone delivering news they aren't entirely sure how to categorize. Not bad news, not good news, but significant news, the kind that rearranges the atmosphere of a day before you've had time to prepare for it. She told me to dress in court colors. She told me to be at the great courtyard by midday. She told me, with a careful neutrality that communicated volumes, that the Alpha King had called a gathering. She didn't tell me what for. I found out when I arrived. The courtyard was full. Not just Ashen Court wolves, I felt that immediately. The way you feel a change in the composition of air before you can identify its source. Different signatures, different pack energies, layered over the court's familiar density like weather systems stacking. I moved through the outer edge of the gathered crowd with my chin level, and my hands still, and found a position near the front where I could see the stone platform at the courtyard's center. Cale was already there, standing with that stillness of his, dark clothing, no ceremony in his dress, but ceremony in his bearing, the kind that doesn't require costuming because it lives in the body itself. His pale eyes were moving through the crowd in the methodical way I'd come to recognize as his baseline mode of occupying any space, present everywhere, resting nowhere, until they found me. And for a moment, just a moment, they rested. Then he looked back out at the crowd, and he spoke. His voice carried without effort, the way the voices of very old, very settled power always do, not by volume, but by some quality underneath volume, some frequency that the air itself seemed to conduct cooperatively. He said that the Ashen Court was making a formal announcement of intent. He said that he would be taking a mate. He said my name. The courtyard went through several things in rapid succession. First, a silence so total it had texture. Then a sound not quite a murmur, more the aggregate noise of several hundred people processing something simultaneously, each reaction individual but the collective effect, a single atmospheric shift, and beneath that shift, threading through it like a current through water, I felt something change in the mark on my throat. The light asylum press of 3 days ago warming, deepening, reaching through my skin into something below the surface, and beginning very slowly, very deliberately to pull. A promise. He was making a promise in front of everyone. I stood in the crowd and felt it move through me, and did not let my face do a single thing I hadn't authorized, which cost me more than I expected. Because the truth, the honest, unguarded truth of what I felt in that moment was complicated in a way that had no clean name. There was fear in it, and there was something that was absolutely not fear, and there was the particular vertigo of having the future tilt toward you very fast when you'd spent the last several days telling yourself to only think about right now. And then I heard his voice. Not Cale's. Caden's. He came through the crowd the way alphas enter spaces when they haven't been invited, and want to make that fact visible, cutting through, not around. The gathered bodies parting for him out of reflex and the biological imperative to yield to concentrated dominance. He was furious. I could feel it from 20 feet away, that particular alpha anger that doesn't shout because it doesn't need to, that runs hot under a controlled surface the way lava runs underground that looks solid. He stepped onto the edge of the platform space, looked at Cale, and then with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something that had no name in the language of the easy authority he'd always worn, he looked at me. "This is Blackridge's wolf," he said. To Cale, but with his eyes still on me. "This is a pack matter. Internal. She returns with me." The courtyard went quieter than it had been before, which shouldn't have been possible and was. I felt the crowd hold its breath. Felt Cale's presence shift, not dramatically, not with the visible inflation of an alpha performing territorial response, but in the way a current changes direction. Immediate and absolute, and requiring no announcement. He stepped down from the platform. He crossed the space. And he came to stand beside me. Not in front, not between Caden and me in the performed, look at me protecting, her way that would have made me a thing being defended rather than a person being stood beside. His shoulder level with mine, his body angled just slightly so that his presence anchored the space around me without consuming it. Equal, deliberate. A signal so precise in its construction that I understood it was constructed that he had made a choice, in the space of a few steps, about what kind of statement he was making and how. Partnership, not possession. I felt something move through my chest. He looked at Caden. "She isn't Blackridge's wolf," he said. Quiet, factual, final. "She hasn't been since she walked out of your hall, and she walked out of your hall because you gave her no reason to stay." The silence was enormous. Caden's jaw tightened. That familiar tell, I knew it. Had memorized it without meaning to, in the time before I'd understood that some maps are for territories you'll never get to keep. His dark eyes moved from Kyle to me, and in them I saw it again, that complicated, fractured something that he'd buried so fast in the hall that I'd half convinced myself I'd imagined it. Except I hadn't imagined it. I could see it now, clearer than before, stripped of the public staging that had surrounded it that night. Something that looked uncomfortably like recognition arrived too late. He looked at me for a long moment. I looked back, and I felt nothing. Not the bond tug, not the phantom warmth, not the ache that had lived in my sternum for days like a bruise pressed repeatedly. Whatever thread had been reaching between us was thin now, thinning further, in real time, as I stood in Cale's proximity with Cale's mark warming in my throat and Cale's shoulder steady beside mine. "This isn't finished," Caden said. "It is," I said. He looked at me one final time, something moving behind his eyes, that I chose, deliberately, not to try to name, and then he turned and walked back through the crowd that parted for him again, the same as before, except that the room he left behind him felt entirely different from the one he'd entered. Cale turned his head toward me. I turned mine toward him. We looked at each other for a moment that had no business being as quiet as it was, given everything surrounding it. Then, so low that only I could hear it, "All right?" 2 words. That voice, that careful private register he used when he was removing words from the room and handing them directly to me. I breathed out slowly. "Yes," I said, and meant it in more ways than I knew how to say. He came to me that night. Not unexpectedly, there had been a conversation, formal and clear, in the hours after the assembly, about what the announcement meant and what came next, and what I understood I was agreeing to. He was like that, meticulous about consent, in a way that didn't make a performance of being meticulous. He simply ensured that I knew, that I had chosen, that the choosing was mine. It was, completely, without reservation, without the murky, complicated grief of the bond pull that had made every choice in Blackridge feel contaminated. This was clean. This was mine. He came to my quarters and he stood in the doorway, and he looked at me in that way he had full and specific and without the social performance of pretending to look elsewhere, and I looked back at him, and the air between us was very still. "We don't have to do this tonight," he said. "I know," I said. "I want to." Something moved through his face. That thing he usually kept below the surface, the thing that his controlled expression and his careful voice and his meticulously maintained stillness couldn't entirely contain when we were close, and the hour was late, and the room was quiet. It moved through him visibly, for once not hidden, not buried, not managed into something smaller and safer, just present. He crossed the room, slowly. Every step deliberate, every movement announcing itself, giving me space inside the approach to change my mind, to step back, to say anything that needed saying. I said nothing. I stayed exactly where I was, standing in the low firelight with my pulse in my throat and my hands finally still. He stopped in front of me, close, closer than the study, closer than the training ground, closer than any of the careful, measured distances he had maintained over 3 days of deliberate restraint that I was only now understanding had cost him something real. His hand came up to my hair, moved it aside, slowly, with a gentleness so precise it was its own kind of intensity. His fingers grazed my neck, and I felt it everywhere. The full body, bone-deep awareness of being touched by someone who has been withholding touch. The particular voltage of patience finally released. He lowered his head. I felt his breath at my throat first, warm and slow, moving across the skin just above where his mark already lived, and I understood in that breath that he was pausing, taking a moment. Not from uncertainty, there was no uncertainty in him right now. It had burned away sometime between the courtyard and this room, but from something else. Something that felt like the weight of meaning, like a man who understood exactly what he was about to do, and was choosing to feel it fully before he did it. I felt his hesitation. Not doubt, never doubt, just fullness. The fullness of a moment held before it becomes permanent. His lips touched my throat, and then I heard him, barely audible, barely breath, in a voice I had never heard from him before, stripped of control, stripped of the careful architecture he built around everything he communicated, down to something that was just him, just the truest register of the man underneath all the authority and the stillness and the pale eyes that saw everything. Mine. And he bit. The pain was clean and bright and immediate, a flash, sharp and clarifying, like the first breath of cold air after a long time underground. It moved through me in a wave, base of throat to fingertips to the soles of my feet, and for one suspended second everything was only that bright and certain and real. And then it shifted. The pain became something else. It became relief. I don't have a better word for it. Relief, the full body, cellular, bone-deep relief of something that has been held apart for a long time, finally being allowed to come together. Like a door that's been braced shut finally opening. Like a sound that's been building behind a wall finally breaking through. It moved through me in waves that were warm and overwhelming and brought with them something I hadn't felt in so long. I'd half convinced myself I'd never feel it again. Safety. Peace. The silence inside me, the absence that had been living in my chest since the night in that hall. Since the bond tore and I walked out into the cold and told myself I could survive this, that silence ended. Just like that. Like a note finding its chord. Like coming home to a place you've never been but somehow always known. My wolf rose. Not fading. Not flickering. Not thin and depleted. And running on nothing but stubbornness. She rose the way she was meant to, full and fierce and luminous. Every part of her that had been suppressed by damage and distance, and the long, terrible weight of being rejected by someone who was supposed to choose you, all of it returned. Returned and then some, burning through me like the first sun after a long winter, until I couldn't hold it anymore, until the only honest response to what was moving through my body was the one that required my whole throat and the whole night sky to contain it. I tipped my head back, and I howled. Not the sound of something broken, not the sound of something begging or grieving or making itself small enough to fit into spaces that were never meant for it. The sound that left me was full and clear and completely, unapologetically mine, the sound of a wolf who had walked through fire and come out the other side and was standing in her own territory, in her own body, claimed by her own choice, and was not afraid of the sound she made. Kale's arms came around me, not tightly, not possessively, just there, solid and warm and real, circling me from behind with the steady, unperformed certainty of someone who has made a decision and is entirely at peace with it. His face against my temple, his breath slow and even against my cheek. And in the bond, the new bond, the real bond, the one that didn't hurt, I felt him. Clearly. Without translation. Without the second hand, blurred at the edges sensation of someone else's experience reaching me uninvited. This was direct. This was mutual. This was two people connected on purpose, clearly, with full knowledge of what they were building. I felt his warmth. I felt his steadiness. And underneath both of those, running quiet and deep and absolutely certain, I felt him feel me and choose me anyway. I closed my eyes, let the sound fade, let the night hold what it was holding. And for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, I didn't have to be strong enough not to need anything. I just gotta be here, whole, and finally, home. 3 days after the marking, Caden came back. I felt him before the alarm reached us, felt the shift in the territory's energy, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure, that subtle, full-body awareness of something incoming that your wolf registers before your conscious mind catches up. I was in the map room with Kale when his head of house came through the door with that particular expression that meant the news was neither small nor simple. Caden Voss had crossed the eastern border, with 6 of his men, and a formal challenge declaration. Kale went very still in the way that he went still when something required his full attention. Not the passive stillness of inaction, but the coiled, absolute quiet of something deciding. His pale eyes moved to me for just a moment. Not checking, not asking, just acknowledging, seeing me. Then he straightened and turned and walked toward the door with the unhurried precision of a man who has never needed to rush toward anything because nothing has ever been faster than him. I followed. The courtyard had already gathered by the time we arrived. News moves through a pack the way scent moves through air, instantly and without effort. Caden was at the center of the open ground, his 6 men fanned at his back, and the contrast of it struck me immediately, the deliberate theater of it, the number of bodies brought as backdrop, the performance of force that told me, more clearly than any declaration, that this wasn't really about challenge protocol. This was about me. He looked at Kale with the particular controlled fury of a man who had made a decision too late and was refusing to admit that the timing was the problem. "You took something that wasn't offered," he said. "She offered herself," Kale said. "To me, with her own voice, in my own territory. She was confused, displaced. You took advantage of. I made my choice with full clarity. My voice, cutting across the space between them before I'd consciously decided to speak, landing in the courtyard air with a flatness that surprised even me. Both of them looked at me. The crowd looked at me. I stepped forward. This conversation is being had about me, in front of me, as though I'm not standing here. I'd like to correct that." Caden's eyes locked on mine. Something moved in them, that fracture again. That complicated, too-late thing that I had spent days trying to name and was finally standing here with Kale's mark warm in my throat and my wolf solid and burning inside me, able to name clearly. It was regret. Real, genuine, arrived after the damage regret. And I felt nothing. Not triumph. Not the bitterness I might have expected. Nothing. Just the clear, clean observation of a fact. "Come home," he said. "Quieter now. Just to me. This is my home." His jaw tightened. "Lyra." "No." The word was gentle. "Absolute. You had a choice, Caden. You made it. In front of everyone. You chose, and I watched you choose. And then I walked out and I kept walking and I found my way here. That's not confusion. That's not displacement. That's what choosing looks like when someone is actually doing it. I held his gaze. You don't get to challenge his claim because you've changed your mind. I'm not the prize in this. I never was. The courtyard was completely silent. Caden looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I understood he was really looking, maybe for the first time, at what was actually standing in front of him rather than the version he'd filed me under in his mind. Something in his face shifted. The fury cooled into something quieter and more honest and considerably more painful to look at. He took one step forward. Kale moved. Not dramatically. Not the full aggressive surge of an alpha whose claim is being challenged. Just forward. Steady. Deliberate. Placing himself not in front of me but beside me. Close enough that his arm nearly brushed mine. Close enough that his warmth reached me. And I felt through the bond the exact quality of what was running through him right now. Not rage. Not performance. Something far more controlled and far more dangerous than either. Certainty. He looked at Caden across the narrow distance. She's told you her choice, he said. Quiet. Final. The voice of a man who has said the last thing he intends to say on a subject. Hear it. Caden heard it. I watched him hear it, watched it move through him, the reality of it, settling into the lines of his face and the set of his shoulders with the particular weight of something irrevocable. His eyes came back to me one last time, and in them briefly, openly, without the careful control he usually kept over his expressions, I saw grief. Genuine grief. For a future that had existed only as possibility. For a thread he'd been handed and set down and found, too late, that setting down had been permanent. I didn't look away from it. I let him see that I saw it. And then I said, quietly and completely and from a place so deep in myself that no part of it was performance. I choose him. 2 words. Out loud. To Caden. To the courtyard. To myself. Maybe most of all because even now, even with the bond warm and real and singing quietly in my chest, there is something important about saying the true thing with your own voice in front of witnesses. Something that makes it fully real in a way that internal certainty alone doesn't quite complete. Caden looked at me for one final breath. Then he stepped back. He turned to his men, something passed between them without words. The silent pack communication of a decision distributed. And then he walked back toward the eastern border without another word. Without looking back, with the dignity of a man absorbing a loss and choosing not to make it smaller by raging at it. I watched him go, and felt the old bond go fully quiet. Not severed, not violently, not with the tearing agony of the first rejection, just released, gently, like a held breath finally let go, like a chapter ending at the right sentence, arriving at its period with something that felt almost like grace. Kale's hand found mine. Not a performance. Not for the crowd. Just his hand, warm and large, closing around mine with a certainty so quiet and complete, it made my eyes sting for reasons I wasn't prepared to examine in public. I let him hold it, and the courtyard exhaled around us. He came to my quarters that night. Our quarters, technically the formal transition had been swift and practical in the way that things in the Ashen Court were swift and practical, Kale being constitutionally opposed to prolonging administrative processes that had already been decided. But it still felt like mine in the particular way of a space you haven't fully inhabited yet, where your things exist but the room hasn't learned your rhythms. He was leaning against the window frame when I came in from washing, arms folded, looking out at the night with that expression of his that meant he was thinking about something specific and had decided not to perform not thinking about it. He turned when I came in. Looked at me for a moment in the quiet way he had. Are you sure? He asked. Just that. No preamble. No softening of the question. He wanted the true answer, and he was asking for it directly, which was the most Kale way of doing anything, and which I had, over the past several days, discovered I found deeply, inconveniently endearing. I looked at him across the room. At his pale eyes and his severe face and his arms folded with that careful, contained energy that I had learned was not coldness, but its opposite was in fact the way a man holds himself when he feels things strongly and has spent years building architecture around that fact, so it doesn't overwhelm the prosa nature. Room. I've never been more certain of anything, I said. Something happened to his face. The architecture came down. Not all of it. Not permanently, I didn't expect that and wouldn't have wanted it. That careful structure being as much a part of him as his pale eyes or his impossible stillness. But enough. Enough that what I was looking at, in the warm, low light of our room at the end of this impossible day, was just him. Just Kale. Without the Alpha King layered over the top. He crossed the room. Stopped in front of me. Raised his hand and tucked a piece of hair behind my ear with a carefulness so practiced and so gentle that it was clearly something he'd thought about. Not planned exactly, but considered. The way he considered everything. "Then you're mine," he said, low, warm. And underneath the warmth, something that resonated through the bond like a chord struck cleanly full and real and resonant with everything that word meant from him. In this context, having watched him define mine as stand beside, not in front, as hear her voice, as step back and let her choose. He looked at me steadily. "And I am yours." The last word landed differently from the first. Quieter, more weighted, more given, like something he was handing over rather than claiming, like the more frightening, more important half of the sentence. I felt it move through the bond, the absolute cellular truth of it. I looked at him for a moment, and then because the alternative was doing something embarrassing with my eyes, I said, "You're very dramatic." He blinked. Once. "I'm dramatic," he said. Flat. With that micro-movement at the corner of his mouth that I had learned was his version of laughing. The declaration in the courtyard. The standing beside instead of in front, which was very calculated, by the way. I noticed that. "The woman who crossed a sovereign border at dawn," he said, "on a depleted wolf, dripping river water, and demanded my warriors take her to their alpha, is calling me dramatic." I was making a practical decision. You were soaking wet and shaking, and you still managed to look like you'd planned the whole thing. I had planned the whole thing. Lyra. Mostly. The corner of his mouth moved again further this time. Far enough that it qualified, officially, as a smile. Small and real and completely unperformed, arriving on that severe face like sunlight on stone and changing the whole landscape of it. I felt something turn over in my chest. Warm and certain and absolutely terrifying and completely right. He pressed his forehead to mine, closed his eyes, and I felt through the bond not words, not images, just feeling, direct and clear and unambiguous everything he wasn't saying out loud. The relief of it, the depth of it, the particular feeling of someone who has held themselves apart from things for a long time finally arriving somewhere and recognizing, with every part of themselves, that they are done holding. I closed my eyes too, and let the quiet hold us. A month later, I stood at the edge of the eastern overlook at dawn, alone, which was a choice Kale had offered to come, and I had asked for this particular morning to be mine. And he had said, of course, without making it mean anything complicated, because he understood the difference between solitude and distance, and had never once made me feel guilty for needing the first. The territory spread below me in the early light. Vast and gray-green and cold and extraordinary in the particular way of land that knows what it is, the Ashen Court, its forests and its rivers and its borders. Solid and real and humming with the energy of a pack that had existed here long before me and would exist here long after. My pack now. My territory. My home in a way that had nothing to do with default or compromise or the absence of alternatives. In a way that had everything to do with choice mine, made clearly, made repeatedly, made out loud in front of witnesses and internally in the dark, and in every small daily decision since. I felt Caden at a distance. Not through a bond that thread was gone now, released cleanly in the courtyard, dissolving into something neutral and quiet that I neither mourned nor celebrated. Just felt him the way you feel. Any familiar energy from far away, a recognition without attachment. He was at the tree line below the overlook. I could see him, small with distance, standing at what was technically still Blackridge land, looking up at the court's high ground with an expression I couldn't read from here and had stopped needing to. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked back at the sunrise, and felt nothing where the wound used to be. Not numbness, not suppression, not the careful management of something still raw. Just nothing. Clean space. The way a healed scar feels different from skin that has never been touched, present, textured. part of your history, but no longer something that needs tending. No longer something that shapes every movement around its own sensitivity. Through the bond, warm and steady as a heartbeat, I felt Kyle wake. Felt the exact moment his awareness came online. That characteristic instant of full alertness that he moved from sleep into, no gradual surfacing, just present, and felt him orient toward me across the distance of the stronghold between us. Felt the particular quality of his attention, warm and specific and always like being really seen. He didn't call me back. He just held the bond open between us. Let me feel him there. Available. Present. Not pulling, not managing, just with me, across the distance, in the way that the bond allowed, and that I was still learning to receive without flinching. Still learning that being felt by someone who chooses to feel you is not the same as being watched. Still learning that warmth at your back is not always the prelude to a hand between your shoulder blades pushing. It takes time. Learning that. Learning to receive something good without waiting for the part where it costs you. But I was learning. I looked out at the territory one more time. At the light moving across it, slow and golden, and indifferent to everything that had happened to bring me here. The rejection and the river and the dark hours and the bond torture and the courtyard and the choice said out loud. Indifferent but present. Lighting all of it equally. The wound and the healing and the woman standing at the overlook in the early morning of a life she had built out of the wreckage of the one she'd been handed. I wasn't marked because I was desperate. I want to be clear about that. Even now, especially now. I was not a woman who arrived here broken and was put back together by someone else's love. I arrived here choosing. I arrived here demanding to be taken to the alpha. I arrived here with my chin up, and my hands shaking, and my wolf guttering, and my dignity completely, stubbornly intact. I was marked because I was chosen, by a man who stood beside me, not in front, who lowered his voice instead of raising it, who brought tea to a woman who couldn't sleep and sat across the room and simply stayed, who cupped my face like something he was afraid of damaging, who asked, "Are you sure?" even when the answer was already written in every line of everything that had brought us here. I was marked because I was chosen, and this time, I chose back. Not from fear, not from the desperate, beautiful pull of a bond I didn't get to consent to, not from the absence of alternatives or the exhaustion of running, or the small, terrible arithmetic of settling because something is better than nothing. From here, from this exact place in my chest, solid and warm and completely mine, from the woman standing at the edge of an overlook at dawn in her own territory, with her wolf burning steady and her bond humming quiet and her whole life arranged, finally, in a shape she had built herself. From choice, pure and clear and absolute, the sun cleared the tree line. Light moved across the ashen court, and I turned from the view from Caden's distant figure, from the old territory, from the old wound, and walked back toward the stronghold, back toward Kale, back toward home. Not running, not escaping, just walking, freely, toward everything I had chosen, and everything that had chosen me back. Thank you for listening to another emotional, magical shifter romance here on Moonbound Romance Tales. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you never miss more powerful, heart-gripping romance stories.